Check one, two, three. Hey everybody, it's Michael Helms, also known as Michael the Sound Guy, and this is the Location Sound Podcast. You know, each episode we talk with location sound mixers, boom ops, and other industry pros about the various aspects of recording sound on location, whether it's for feature and independent films, TV commercials, interviews, any time where dialogue from actors is recorded. I started my career in the recording studios in New York City with some of the big artists back in the day, and later on projects for networks like HBO, Sci-Fi Channel, and the Cartoon Network. As time went by, I got out of the studio and began working in production sound. Whether you're a seasoned veteran or just starting out, thanks for joining us. All right, my special guest today is a Hollywood veteran sound mixer and has worked on numerous blockbuster films throughout his career, including Hunt for Red October, Days of Thunder, Ghost, Wayne's World, Good Morning Vietnam, and The Godfather Part 3. He's worked and taught in all areas of production and post-production sound, and he's currently teaching the next generation of filmmakers. He also lives in Norway. Please welcome Greg Curda.
Hello, Michael.
Welcome, Greg.
Well, thanks for having me.
Now, Greg, we usually start the show by asking what's in your audio kit, but you've kind of stepped away from that these days as an educator. So take us back 30 years and talk to us about what gear you were using back then.
Okay, let's see. So that would be the 80s. And I think my feature kit was a Cooper CS106 as the primary mixer, and everybody had just gone to DAT. So I bought myself an HHB, 1,000 plus or whatever the model number is, and I really loved it. Most people were still using Nagras, but I really liked it. Electrosonic 185s, okay, VHF, swinging. Since I went back to production when I went to Hawaii, I really couldn't use Sheps. It was way too humid for that. So the MKH series in Sennheisers, the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s is what I mostly used. And I had some COS 11 lavs. That's basically it.
Now, as you're teaching students today, what are they learning on?
Sound devices, mixers, mostly all bag stuff. We don't have a feature rig put together, but 302s. We have some mix pre-10s. I've got some MM1s, the little single channel things. Those are really good too. I like those a lot. Running mostly Rode MTG3s for the shotguns, Sennheiser G3s, of course, with the stock mics. And let's see, I've got a couple of F8s, Zoom F8s, and the controllers. And for multicam stuff, we just moved to that new Zoom L12, the live track, which is pretty swinging. It's pretty cool. The kids are figuring it out, so it's okay. And then for the interior mics, we've got a bunch of Octavas with all the capsules, so we just mix and match.
Now, tell us a little bit about how you first got into the film industry.
Okay, that's interesting. One of my dad's best friends was a big picture and sound editor in Chicago at the time. And his big gig at that time was the Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom. Most of your audience probably is not old enough to remember Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom, but it was the original nature show. And so he was looking for a new apprentice, and he asked my dad, do you think Greg would be interested? And I was like 17 at the time. And he said, sure, this sounds cool. Why don't you ask him? So he asked me, and I said, film business? Yeah, sure, that sounds cool. 17, I don't know anything. This guy's name was Jim Bourgeois. What a great man. And he taught me, and he just took me under his wing and taught me a bunch of stuff. We worked on that show. We got a lot of commercials, and mostly 16, some national spots in 35, but it was all film. I learned how to go out and record effects and stuff on an Nagra with the 415, I think they had it at that time. We had a 415, a 405, and an 815. So the three sizes. And that was a gas. So I really had learned to be an editor. By the time I was 20 or so, I started having my own clients. He gave me, some clients. We became partners and stuff. So, and then, at some point I decided that I wanted to go see if I could play with the big boys. So it really wasn't sound at all. It was picture cutting. That was my first thing.
When you decided to go sound, how did you get into the industry?
Kind of by chance. I had moved to LA, and I was playing in a band. I'm a bass player as well. The guy who was financing the band, turns out he was financing it through various illicit activities in Orange County, and he got popped, and so the financing stopped. And I went to a temp agency, and this temp agency kind of specialized in placing musicians and such in studio gigs. Well, my first temp gig was at Columbia, Warner Brothers on the Burbank lot. And I was the temporary secretary for Robert Towne. And I don't know if you remember who Robert Towne was. He's a writer. He wrote Chinatown, Two Jakes, a bunch of stuff, but he was out of town for 2 weeks. His secretary was out of town for 2 weeks. And so I sat in. The only thing I did for 2 weeks is every day I got one phone call, and that was from the secretary asking me if there were any calls. Other than that, nothing happened. But then I transferred to Disney, and I got a temp job at Disney in the computer tape library. And eventually that led to begging and pleading to get an interview for the mailroom. Okay. I mean, you have no idea how hard it is to get into the mailroom. So from the mailroom, I got to be friends with the secretary in the sound department, and she really liked me for some reason. And there was a spot opening up, entry level Y15, I think the union classification is. And the guy who interviewed me for it was from Chicago and knew Jim Bourgeois. Right place, right time. Lucky break. Combined. So then I started in the sound department at Disney and learned the ropes there.
What was the early days? Like you started off, you were in the analog world. And tell us a little bit about how that prepared you for going into the digital world.
Well, first of all, you have to understand that the film business is very slow to adopt new technology, much slower than, for instance, the music business, the record industry. They want the newest, latest, greatest all the time. That's really changing now, but in the old days, it wasn't. If you had something that worked, you stuck with it until it didn't work anymore, because you can't take the chance, right? So when I went to Disney, for instance, on the dialogue stage, they were still recording dialogue sessions direct to disc, cutting vinyl. It was pretty amazing, actually. The place was full of all old RCA film recorders, and the film, sound film, is really just like tape, magnetic tape, but it has sprocket holes. It's shaped like film, and it runs, with the picture on these machines. So we ran that for a long time, and then eventually we got to the point where there was a guy in LA, and he created a new kind of a controller. And this controller allowed you to sync film projectors with tape machines, SMPTE based, so you could sync with a free running machine. This was this was genius stuff back then. We take it for granted now, but this was genius stuff. So the projector, he had a little rig that went on the projector, and he converted the tach pulses into time code information. And then with a series of links, synchronizers, you could synchronize your 24 track. And I had a Studer A800, I think. And this was like the state of the art at the time, had Dolby SR in the drawers and just a beautiful machine, self-aligning. I mean, what a great machine. So towards the end of my time, this was at Paramount, after I had left Disney and gone to Paramount, we experimented with a few things. We experimented with a synclavier system for like 2 or 3 weeks. And it was very difficult. It wasn't set up right. There were a couple of DAWs there at the time, just starting to come in. Pro Tools was just beginning and wasn't quite accepted yet. And I can't remember the name of the one that they were using to cut dialogue, but they had just switched over, and this was late 80s. So it was kind of strange, and I never really, in that phase of my career, I never truly got out of analog. That didn't happen till I left town and started production mixing again, and then I had to catch up and get into the digital world. It was interesting. People didn't quite know what to think about it. It was still easier to scrape the tape than try to figure out how to do a fade. So strange times.
What were some of the early challenges, I guess, with DAT tape?
I think the biggest thing was the whole discussion about level. For years and years and years, I didn't think there was any difference, and I believed it was the same concept. I've always recorded hot. I try to push it as much as I can. And for instance, when I was at Paramount, I had the tape companies in all the time, looking for that latest, greatest new batch of tape that's going to take, half a dB more level, right? Before saturation. So I would still record pretty hot, peaking at maybe, by today's standards, maybe -6. Okay, which to a lot of people is too hot. But I still thought that you still had to get the most information on the tape. And I don't know if that was wrong or right or whatever, but it worked for me at the time. We didn't use full scale meters still. We were using peak meters and PPMs. And so I would just do what I normally did in analog, and it seemed to work out okay. I eventually came to find out that one of the reasons for the discussion about recording at a lower level was just a simple question of level matching. When you're in a DAW, let's take Pro Tools, for instance, the plugins want to see -20. So when you start lining up a bunch of plugins, if you match that level, your plugins will work properly. If you record hot and you're pumping -6 into the plugin that's looking for -20, you're already kind of overloading and making the plugin work a little harder than it has to, and that's not optimum. But I didn't get that until way later. And this is stuff that the current generation of mixers, they know all this stuff. They know all the math, and we never did. There wasn't any math. It sounded good or it didn't, So I think it's really, really interesting, but I think you can get away with both ways. And then you just at the end of the game, you just raise the level back up to whatever you want, whatever there's -23 LUF or whatever it is now. There's much more math now than there ever was. So I think that's interesting.
When I started off in the studio, the same thing. We were still in analog, but digital was there, and we would always master a 1/2-inch 2-track. And then we would go to DAT, but we would push it, 1 or 2 LEDs from clip, just to maximize the bit.
Yeah, I guess. But, then I also heard earlier on, I had heard that the utilization of your full bit depth didn't kick in until a certain level. So if you were recording like under -20, we started out at -12 was the reference level, right? And then we went to 18, and then we went to 20. Is that about the historical thing? But if you were recording under that, you weren't using all your bits. And I'm like, what? I want to use all my bits. Give me those bits. You can't, no, you can't have my bits. It's like, what's a bit? And I didn't understand the thing about bits until I went to this was an Alesis demonstration at a NAMM show. And they had just rolled out their new series of ADATs that had 20-bit resolution. And they were showing the difference between 16 and 20. And they had an ingenious demo, and it was one piano note. And they just, boom, one piano note, and they just let it die out. And at 16-bit, you could hear where the computer couldn't tell if it was the note or if it was noise and cut it off. And at 20, it just continued, till you almost couldn't hear it, and then it cut it off. So it had much greater resolution. Okay, so to me now, everything, picture and sound, I can kind of relate to it now because it's about resolution, So I thought that was very interesting.
Now, let's jump in and talk a little bit about some of the films you've worked on. One of the big ones was The Hunt for Red October. So tell us a little bit about your experience on that project.
Well, production had run way over to the point where the vice president at Paramount called the entire post department into the theater one day and said, guys, we're under the gun, because they already set a release date, of course. And so we basically had a little more than half the schedule that we originally had. And it was nights, days, weekends, just nonstop. Not only that, we had the U.S. Navy looking over our shoulders all the time asking, where'd you get that recording? Where'd you get that recording? Where'd you get that recording? National secrets and stuff. I think the one ping only, I'm trying to remember how many, it was some ungodly number of pings that we had gone through before we found one that they would accept. And on the Foley stage, we created all these ambiences for the subs, and so the same thing. Where'd you get that recording? And we're like, what recording? We just spent 4 days making this. There's no recording. This is the recording. So they were very, very, very critical about what we could use and what we couldn't use. We were going like gangbusters. I mean, it was a rush for me. I don't mind long hours. I like long hours. I like cranking, So that was fun. And we were actually a little surprised when we got into the bake-off, and I think what it was a lot of the members, the Oscars had been dominated by big effects shows for the last several years. And I think I think everybody was a little tired of the barrage. So, here's this Hunt for Red October with a lot of nice little subtle stuff, really subtle stuff. And we just, boom, died kind of out of nowhere. And that was pretty exciting, I have to say.
Yeah, and you guys, the sound effects team, won an Oscar, correct?
Yeah. Now,
I heard that on set, it was a very noisy set, so there was a lot of ADR after the fact.
Well, yeah. I mean, poor Richard Goodman, who was the production mixer on that show, I mean, I think that he might have gotten 10%, maybe 15, maybe as much as 20% of the dialogue. But it was 2 stages long. So they broke through to the second stage. It was a very, very long set. And they built a hydraulic platform that actually moved. So, for instance, in that scene where in Sean Connery's office, the shot of the teacup sliding down his little table in his office there, or his room, that was actually sliding because they had tipped the whole thing like that. And that thing made a lot of noise, and they had all kinds of equipment on the stage, and it was just loud, loud, loud over there all the time. The shooting stage was right next to my Foley stage, so I went over there and hung out with Richard a bunch, and he was like, I'm not getting anything. Oddly enough, years later, we kind of reprised that situation when we did Wind Talkers, because I did Wind Talkers with him. That was a very interesting thing. 2 production mixers, two complete A crews, 12 cameras. And the way John Woo shot this, he shot 2 scenes at a time. And he shot one scene here, but looking back with this scene in the background. And then he shot another scene here with this scene in the background. 6 cameras each. So he's knocking out 12 shots at a time. I remember the call sheet for the first day. It had all this stuff that listed all the departments. Make sure you have this, make sure you have this, make sure you have this. The sound department, good luck. That's all it said. Because it was just nonstop, a barrage of pyro. So, but that was really fun too. Yeah, production went way over on Red October. And that's why we were kind of short on the post.
Interesting. And then it turned out like it did with an award.
Okay, so that leads right into, I think that Red October, I don't know if maybe it's just my impression, but it changed things. Because what happened is the producers, even though they were in-house, the producers saw that not only can they do the job in half the time, but they can win an Oscar for it. So for me, after Red October, the conditions started changing. Things started changing. We got less time, booked for the shows. Eventually, stuff like quad time went away. Triple time, golden time went away. All this stuff started changing. And it was less time, kind of less additional perks. So it was, I think that was an interesting period too.
You also worked on Days of Thunder. So tell us a little bit about that process.
We had a lot of people working on effects on that. We also had John Fasal working on, I believe, on that, doing a bunch of what used to be called sound design. That's another thing. The term sound design has changed over the years too. Sound design used to be special effects that were, in a lot of cases, based on normal or real, let's say, real life recordings that were electronically altered. We did some stuff also for the cars on that, but we did a lot of stuff for the pit crews and all this kind of stuff. Tires, the physical parts of the car, not the engine. I had been searching for a way to kind of expand the scope of off-speed recording at the time, to the pitch shifting, basically. But in those days, none of the pitch shifters were really that good. The best commercially available one, I think, was the Eventide. And even with that, you could really only get plus or minus 20% clean with no artifacts. I mean, no artifacts. And so, and it wasn't really that much of a range. So, of course, you can always do off-speed recording, but when you're doing stuff to picture, you have to change the projector speed as well. And when you do that, we didn't have variable flexibility. We could double the speed, we could half the speed. Having the speed was really tricky because you risked burning the film. Doubling the speed was okay, and you could do that easily enough, but it meant that your Foley artists, your performers, had to do all this in half the time. They didn't have time to really suss out because it happened fast. So you'd have to get something that was close, move it back into sync, cut it, and try to work with it there. And it wasn't very accurate. So we did a lot of experiments, and I had a great engineer, Mark Lindauer. It really, really helped me a lot. And he was really interested in this. And we tried all kinds of things. We tried to do a variable thing with Jim Fulmus, tried to help us with that as well. And it just wasn't really working. And then one day the rep from Lexicon came by, Scott Esterson. We were talking about this problem. And he goes, well, we might have something that might help you. And it was their commercial time compression expander for broadcast to slightly alter the length of the shows. And it had a built-in pitch shifter. Now, this pitch shifter was absolutely unbelievable. And I talked Lexicon into building me one that didn't have the time compression expansion stuff. It just had the pitch shifter. Insane. 100% clean both ways. An octave up and an octave down, totally clean. Latency, of course. But you just slide it back into sync, And it was amazing. We could do all kinds of amazing things. That's how we got a lot of the stuff for Red October, and a lot of the stuff in Days of Thunder. All that stuff worked great in some of the Star Treks. you could just get really big effects that you normally could not get. I actually found out that I could split the channels, and I could go into the left, come out of the left, go back into the right, and I could get almost 200%. It was just amazing. I come to find out later that this whole algorithm was created by this guy at Stanford, John DeLorto, I think his name is, a professor at Stanford, who had figured out this pitch shifting algorithm. And it was like brilliant. And Lexicon was the only guys that had it, and they didn't even, it wasn't a feature. It was just something that, that went along with the time compression. Interesting. It was really, really cool.
Well, now also too, I guess you guys added a lot of sound effects and animal sounds with the car engines to try to help differentiate the characters and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, they did a whole bunch of stuff. I didn't really do any of that, but I know Fasal did a lot, and CC and George were the supervisors. They were totally on top of this, and the sound effects guys were going crazy. They were doing all kinds of stuff. So yeah, animal sounds. And the thing about post effects is it's really all about layering, and putting a bunch of different sounds together into a comp, really, and that creates the new effect. I mean, the chances of finding something in a library that, that's going to work for every situation is small. Even backgrounds, most backgrounds are comps out of 2 or 3 other things, so once you get the layering thing together, and some people do it in frequency. They have a high element, a mid element, and a low element, and they combine it, frequency wise. So there's a bunch of different ways to do it, but animal sounds are great for a lot of stuff.
At one point, you were working on multiple films at the same time, working at Disney, working at Paramount, and you were running back and forth doing post work on all of them, right?
Well, I think that was more at Disney when I was actually working on more than one show at once. Well, no, because I did pick up some nights for a while doing some other shows. I don't know. I like to work a lot. I really liked it, I don't know why. It was a rush, man. And I loved Foley. I really love Foley. And I kind of got a lot of grief from my mentoring mixers for not going dubbing, for not going to the dub stage. Why you stay in the Foley stage? You should be re-recording. You should be moving. And I don't know. I just liked it so much. I wanted to stay. I liked the way I felt, and I liked what I could do. And I was getting some really great stuff, and everybody was liking it. And so I liked staying there. Until I left and then had to relearn how to be a production mixer. That was interesting too. So,
you said you'd started off as a bass player, as a musician. How did that affect your recording in the film world?
I think in 2 ways. I think timing. It definitely helped. It helped my punch-ins. You see, in the old analog days, it was all destructive punching in and out. Now now you could just punch anywhere and move it. But in those days, you had to kind of come in at a certain place, and one of the toughest things to do with punch-ins is like in the middle of a run. Punching into footsteps in the middle of the run for a surface change. And I remember one of the guys who really taught me how to do it well was a Foley artist named Ed Stidell. And Ed, another Chicagoan, we were doing Good Morning Vietnam. And there's a scene where Robin Williams he's on the tarmac, and he's running towards the plane. The plane is like way off in the distance, and he's running towards the plane. And just, you can barely see that he hits the metal stairs going up to the plane. And we're squinting, where the hell, and Stidell turns around and he goes, all right. He used to call me Earl. He said, all right, Earl, we're going to punch in for the stairs. And I'm like, what? We're going to what? So, that made me much more critical about the punch-ins. And you had to be able to punch in between the beats, which were the steps, right? So musical knowledge really helped me on that. And I think the other way in which it helped generally is just a general sense of aesthetic. A lot of mixers that I know either are musicians or came from music. Perhaps they were music mixers first and then moved into post. I think the musical sensibilities just helps you give a general aesthetic sense of what works and what doesn't. And that's a very difficult concept. What makes something work as opposed to not work? You can't really describe it. You just know what it is because it feels good. It's a feel thing. And, that's the hardest thing. You can't teach that really, but you just, maybe through constant exposure, but that's something that every mixer has to develop for themselves. But I think that the musicality helped a lot with that.
How do you hone the skills of, say, new students, filmmakers that are coming up, and, how do you bring about that sound awareness?
It's tough. First of all, sound is always the last in the chain. You're the last one to set up on production. As soon as camera's ready, you got to be ready to go, and you haven't seen anything yet. In post, you can't really get on it until you got a picture lock. Student picture editors are forever changing the picture. It's not an easy sell. The students are looking sound. Well, Greg, where's the upside? The upside is the joy that you get when it works. I can't think of a lot of other upsides except that you will work. If you're good and your tracks aren't terrible, you'll work. But I think what it comes down to is they have to hear it, and it's got to click. And once you hear it and it clicks, it drives you. And that's what I try to get out of them. If I get lucky and I get 3 or 4 per class that are interested, I'm very lucky. Most students want to be directors, of course, until they find out what a director really has to do. They don't just sit back in the chair and say, you over there, okay, roll. It's a lot more involved than that. But I also think that production is a tougher sell than post. Post, you've got, you can sit down, you can be at a computer, you can take your time. There's no rush. Well, not for them at this stage yet. Production, there's tension. There's, you got to get it right. Does this sound okay or not? That's the biggest thing. Is this right or not? This doesn't sound right. Is there anything I can do about it? I don't know. That's a hard thing. So you just have to try and expose them. And I try to go on some of the productions with them, but at the same time, I want them to discover things for themselves. And I want them to report these things that they discovered, even if they screw it up. Because I heard a great quote recently. Wisdom is nothing but the sum total of all our mistakes. And I thought, God, that's right. That's exactly right. Because everything I know because I screwed it up the first time. And so I'm like, oh, no, that's not right. It's practically based in a lot of cases. But once they hear it and once they get it and once they achieve something, that's kind of when I can work with them. But it is a tough sell.
How can we improve the relationship between production and post-production?
This is something that I think is really, really necessary now, the greater coming together. In the old days, they were two totally separate things, and the production mixer's view is, I don't know, it's leaving here, sounds good here, and the sound editor's thing is, was there even a mixer on this shoot? Okay, so the two sides are like opposed diametrically, but nobody knows the other's problems. And I think that now we can have a greater interchange of that. If you're an editor, you have to know the situations on the set. That could be the best track he could get, and it could not work. But it could be. It's not because he's not trying. It's because that's the best he can get. Okay, so good. Flag this for ADR and move on. But at the same time, the production mixer needs to think about what's going to happen in post, not just have this sense of, well, they'll figure it out. Good sound reports are still a must. On reality, you don't have that luxury. You really don't, on any run and gun, anything, you really don't have the luxury of sound reports. It's got to be a sit-down gig. But the more you can do, the more you can give notes to any kind of script supervisor, that anything that helps out the editor will love you. It's not uncommon for sound post guys to recommend production mixers to the production department, especially for companies like the WB, Warner Brothers, or any of the bigger companies that are doing a whole bunch of shows. The producers ask, how are these tracks? And if the editor says, these are the best he can get. I know these are the best he can get. He's doing the best he can for us. We need this guy. And he'll work. And then the production mixer, needs to go to post. What can I do for you? What do you need? You want more room tone? How about some wild dialogue? Will that work for you? Oh, I love wild dialogue. Yeah. Give me wild dialogue. They need to talk and not have this separation thing, because it's not. And I think for me, this was the realization after working both post and production is, wait a minute, you have to have a holistic view of sound. Otherwise, the parts don't fit. And when you do, you say, okay. And so now as a production mixer, I think more about post when I'm doing that. And if I'm cutting, then I think, okay. Well, yeah, he must have been having problems there. Maybe he put something somewhere else, and I'm looking for that extra material. But maybe the production mixer is saying, note, extra material here, with an arrow. So it's the cooperation that needs to happen. So any help that you can give them, I think is a benefit to both sides.
That is true. What is your philosophy when you sit down? It's like, here's a completed edit, basically, when it comes to the film, and you've got your input from the director. What is your workflow?
For me, I always start with the dialogue, and I try to get the dialogue track nice and smooth and swinging, and get find my room tones, find my fill, and then I try to find backgrounds after that, because I want to play the bed of the dialogue and the backgrounds and see how that whole thing moves together, because then I know that I can add the effects and it's going to be okay because I've got the foundation. And to me, I consider the dialogue and the backgrounds to be the foundation. So once that's swinging, then I'll go back and start working on the effects. I think the temptation is to get sidetracked, is to get, you're working the dialogue, and you get sidetracked. I need an effect there. And you break off and you go and start looking for effects. Well, that takes your head out of that where you were in the dialogue. And I really think it's important to keep the continuity of thought and not break out of that. Finish the dialogue. Is it boring? Yes, of course it's boring. It's called work. It has to get done. This is your foundation. All the pretty effects in the world aren't going to save it if you can't hear the dialogue. Dialogue is still king, in other words. Okay? And then the reason I like to do backgrounds next is because if I have any problems in dialogue that I can't get around, I want to see what's the minimum I need to be able to mask that problem. Okay, and so that's when I'll turn to the backgrounds, and I'll start working with the backgrounds, seeing if I can a lot of times, even if you have a problem in dialogue, you have a noise or you have something in dialogue that you can't get around for whatever reason, just even, let's say you pick a suburban neighborhood, it's an exterior scene, you pick a suburban neighborhood. If you have a dog bark or something in there, you can put that dog bark over that problem in dialogue and you won't really hear the problem. You'll hear the dog. I mean, it's just little things like that. It doesn't work in all cases, but in a lot of cases it does work. You have to think about things in layers and how the layers combine to make the totality. I'm still really old school, but I think that there's basic concepts that don't change. The gear changes, and the gear changes faster than anybody can afford to keep up, I think. I would be broke if I were still in production mixer. I would be broke because you're always buying this new, and each new thing that comes out, I said, God, I gotta have that. It's like, it's nuts. But I think that the basic principles, if you still know the basic principles, you can get out of anything.
All right. Well, one of our big questions we always ask is, what is your worst on-set experience? Or it could be a post experience, but the worst on-set experience.
This will fall under the heading of rookie mistakes when you're no longer a rookie. We were shooting a commercial for a guy who was running for Senate. He was already a House representative, but he was running for Senate. And he was a really nice guy, and we knew this guy, and it was all good. But my friend had rented a new camera, and it was a new Sony Betacam. I think it was when the 400 just came out or something like that. And what Sony had done is they had employed VU meters on their cameras for a long time. And this was the first one they went to a PPM instead of a view, but they didn't tell anybody. Okay. So, I'm lining the thing up, and every now and then I'm listening to, and I didn't have a return. For some reason, I didn't have a return. So I'm listening straight from the mixer. And of course, that's like certain death, right? And so everything sounded great. And, at the end of the thing, we play it back, and it's just a little crunchy on the top end. And I'm like, what is that? Because I had lined the PPM up to 0 instead of -8. Okay, so it is overmodulating, not by a lot, but by just enough to make that top end kind of crunchy and gritty. The whole thing was like that. So we had to reshoot the whole deal. And there was a time before that was even a little bit worse. I ran line output from the mixer into mic in on the camera for the whole thing. Okay, you know what I'm saying? Line level out from the mixer to mic level in on the camera. Okay, total rookie mistake. And it's like, oh my, how could you be so stupid? Because again, I wasn't listening to the camera. I wasn't listening to my recorder. I was listening to my mixer, and gosh, how beautiful it sounded. So that's another one thing I've learned is that no matter how long you've been in the business, you're not infallible. You're always susceptible to some problem that can come along. You for no reason, the universe just reaches out and taps you on the head. Hey, man. But I found that the worst thing to do is not say anything, not fess up. You got to fess up right away. If you take a beating, you take a beating. And I did take a beating one time. I took a very early in my career, I took a beating from Jim Bourgeois. We were doing a show, and I was an assistant editor. And in the old days, when you're building tracks, it's like building one track at a time. And wherever you didn't have anything on your timeline, you had to fill with leader, so that it maintained time in the scope of the whole reel. And we used to use what we called light struck as the fill leader. And this was exposed camera film, basically. So it had emulsion on one side was smooth and the other side had emulsion on. And you always used to be able to test it by, putting your lips on the film, and your lip would stick to the side which is emulsion, so you'd know if it was A-wind or B-wind. Well, I had mislabeled a role, or somebody had mislabeled. I'm not sure if I was my fault or whatever, but I didn't check. And I was in a hurry, and I just built all these tracks and rushed out to the dubbing stage. And Jim is out there with the mixers waiting for me. I dump the tracks off with the machine room guys, run down behind the console, sit down, and go, okay. And I think I was 19 at the time. So they load it up, they go off, and they go running. And it'd be like 5, 4, beep. Hi there, everybody. The whole thing comes to a stop. Mixers get on the intercom. Boys, clean the heads, please. You should be cleaning the heads between every gig, okay? Just clean the heads. Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir. Okay, right away, sir. Clean the heads. Load it up again. Start again. Hi, everybody. Everything comes to a stop. Mixers say, guys, I'm not going to tell you again. Get those heads clean. Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sorry. And I'm sitting there thinking, oh, God, these poor guys. These guys are getting killed. So they do it the third time. We go for the third time. Same thing happens. The mixers get on the intercom and said, boys, and very stern. And I'm like cringing. And then you hear from the machine room, well, yes, sir, sorry, sir. But I'm sorry, but it appears that the tracks are leadered backwards, meaning that the film had been flipped, and now the emulsion side was against the heads, and every time it passes against the heads, it's gumming the heads all up. And that's why it's sounding like that when we come into track. Suddenly, all eyes on me. And I'm like, huh? Improperly leadered? No, impossible. Impossible. It was. Jim made me pay to rebook the time on the dubbing stage because they couldn't wait. They had another client coming in. And that represented about 2 months' salary. And I was so mad. And I didn't get it until years later, and it was the best lesson I ever learned. This is about responsibility. This was your job. If you do it wrong, it's not okay. Somebody has to pay. If you screw up, you must pay. And I think that stuck with me the whole time. I mean, fortunately, the paying that I had to do whenever I did screw up was just, bruises to my ego and my pride. It didn't represent a lot of physical cash. Again, it's always better to say something and take the heat. And actually, the producers will respect you more for that, because everybody screws up every now and then. Is the difference between sound and camera is if you're a camera guy and you screw something up, oh, that's okay, we'll do it again. Oh, yeah, no problem. You're a sound guy and you screw it up, it's like, what?
Exactly.
Right? Oh, gosh.
The follow-up question to that is, have you ever forgotten any equipment that was critical on set?
Probably nothing that I couldn't work around, but it did get to the point where I bought a van. And everything was in the van, and I went everywhere in the van. Even if it was a sit-down interview, nothing. I went everywhere in the van. I had everything with me at one time. It was probably I forgot a couple of adapters, or I forgot something that it was nothing that was critical to my chain. The auxiliary things that would have been nice, or something that I couldn't give the director that I had to kind of work around to make it work, or something, nothing crippling. That's pretty good, at least on my part. Good boy.
Well, you had mentioned Jimmy Seiska earlier, who was a guest on the show.
Yeah.
And he wanted me to ask you about Butch and Les.
Oh, gosh.
He said, who are these guys?
Okay. Butch and Les Wolf, 2 sound editors. Les is a Emmy Award winner. He is Mr. Animation. He did all the Nickelodeon stuff for years, all the cartoons, all the stuff. Fantastic dialogue editor. did tons of features. We worked together on a bunch of things. Butch was a great effects editor and Foley editor, and also Butch had the ability to save a lot of things by being able to cut what we call pre-dubs. And pre-dubs were submixes, we could say. And the thing about cutting pre-dubs is they existed on, in those days, 4-track film, magnetic film. And in order to cut it with no pops, you had to cut it on an angle, which meant that you could not cut everything in sync, because that would require a straight cut. You had to use an angle cut. So he had just this right touch where he could move that cut around, and you could only do it within the confines of one sprocket at a time, a quarter frame at a time. That was your smallest increment. No subframes like we have today. Nudge, 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 nudge. None of that. Quarter frame either way. And he was magic. He was just absolute magic. But they were cousins. Their parents, 2 brothers married 2 sisters. Classic stuff. And they were just really, really great guys. They started a school way out in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. Okay, it's in a place called Saipan. Probably, 3 hours due east of Manila, Philippines, out in the middle of the ocean. You've heard of the Marianas Trench, the deepest place in the ocean? These are the Mariana Islands, which are right along that trench. And Guam is the base island, and it goes up from there. Saipan being one of the next 2. In the middle of nowhere. So they asked me to come out, and I came out. We were just having all kinds of fun. It was so great. We did so much stuff with these kids. We had so many shows going, and it was just fantastic. They were so motivated. And that was my first foray into teaching. And that's actually where I learned how much I didn't know about teaching. Because you can't just spew out a bunch of information to them and have them, take notes and everything's good. You have to explain this stuff in a way that makes sense and is non-technical. It's much more difficult than I ever thought it would be, the teaching part. But we did a bunch of stuff. We had a small little production company there as well. And we went out and did a bunch of gigs. We did a ton of, for instance, Japanese national commercials production, and that was a trip because they operate in a completely different way. And when they get ready to shoot, it's not, okay, everybody ready? Okay. All right, this is 1 Apple Bravo, take 2, clap. It's not like that at all. It happens in the blink of an eye. And if you're not careful, you're going to miss the slate because they're just really fast. And the slates they use are these tiny little things like this. It's kind of cute in a way, but I got used to it because after every take, the talent would leave the set, not stay there and do another take right away. No, the talent would leave the set. They'd discuss it. They'd change something. They'd come back. They'd do another take. They'd go away. So I would just watch the umbrella brigade. And you'd see all these umbrellas going this way and all these umbrellas going that way. And I knew whether they were coming or going or what was happening. And as soon as they started coming back towards the set, I just hit record. I'm not going to get caught, So that was pretty funny. Then Les and I went to the Philippines. There was a guy there, a very wealthy German who had built a studio in Cebu. And he had two shooting stages, full post, ADR stage, Foley stage, dubbing stage. And those rooms were not finished. So he hired Les and me as a consultant to go and basically finish those rooms. And this is at a place called Bigfoot in Cebu. And this is where I met Jimmy. We did those rooms. It was supposed to be a 6-month consulting contract. I was there like almost 7 years. With Les too, and we did some amazing things. We did a feature that was in Chinese, but the actors were all from Hong Kong, and it was supposed to be Mandarin Chinese, not Cantonese, which is the Hong Kong dialect. And none of them liked their performance at all. So we got them all to come to the Philippines, and we looped the entire show, cover to cover, everything. And they loved it. We did it in 3 days. They were just so on it. Boom, 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 boom. And it sounded great. The room sounded great. And the show sounded great. And we played it back, and it was just like this perfect dialogue. We laid it in. It just really, really worked. I was about to submit it for a MPSE award, but they changed their mind at the last minute. And the director, there was some production something that he couldn't live without, and that destroyed the whole thing. And then there was something else over here, and they could. And so the perfect ADR job went down the tubes very rapidly. But we had a great time doing it. But two very good editors and good friends. And Jimmy was good friends with them too. So.
Oh, that's great. Now you're teaching now?
I am.
And what subjects are you teaching the students?
I have sound 1 and sound 2. Sound 1 is production, sound 2 is post. Basic. And, it's intro 2. And then I teach 3 what we call practice or media project classes. They're practice periods, basically. And they have to form groups, and they have to get clients, and they have to knock out product. Media Project 1 is all about commercials, industrials, music videos, that kind of stuff. Media Project 2 is short films. And Media Project 3 is more advanced industrial kind of work, because that's the majority of the work here.
Okay. If some of our listeners wanted to get into location sound, or maybe they're just starting out, what kind of recommendations or encouragement could you give them?
To me, the most important thing is get the mic in the right place. And to me, it doesn't matter what mic you have. If you can't afford to spend $20,000, get an electret. Get something, you put a battery in and go. But just get your ears used to hearing where that sweet spot is. Work it and learn that sweet spot, burn it into your brain. And then catch up on the rest, and just make sure your recording doesn't overload. You can get all bogged down in all the tech, and you spend all this money in the tech, and it's like, well, I spent $20,000 on all this gear. Why my tracks aren't good? So don't think about that. Think about getting the right sound. Think about using what you have to make it the best it can be, so it's pleasing to you. So I would say take the time to learn the basics. Because if you end up being good, and even the first things you do, if they're decent, you will work. Train your ear. Start listening to records. Pick out the guitar part. Pick out the keyboard part. Pick out the bass part. Pick out the hi-hat part. Get more and more critical in your listening, so that you can differentiate between, not only the frequencies, but the timbres, the intensities, the dimensionality, if that's a word. But hone your skills that way. And the other thing is stop, be quiet for like 5 minutes, and write down everything that you hear. And you'd be amazed how much stuff there is that you hear that your ears just filter out on a daily basis. But you have to start hearing those things now, because the mic does not filter any of that out. And you can't be overloaded when you go, oh God, what are all those noises? You have to know what they are. So you can make judgments about what to avoid. Learn your mic patterns. Learn how to use a microphone to reject the sound you don't want just as much as to capture the stuff that you do want. In location dialogue, that's critical. Using the pattern to get rid of what you don't want. And a lot of people don't think of it like that. I think it's critical.
All right, Greg. Well, it's been wonderful talking with you today. And as we start to wrap things up, what's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
Well, you can find me on Facebook, Greg Curda. You can email me if you want, gcurda@gmail. Those would probably be the best two ways. And I'm happy to answer you. I'm happy to discuss this stuff. I love it.
All right. I want to say thanks to Greg Curda for being on the show today. Thanks, Greg.
Hey, thank you, Michael. My pleasure.
And a big thanks to all of our listeners out there. If you'd like us to discuss a particular topic, please send us an email at locationsoundpodcast@gmail.com. We would love for you to subscribe and leave us a comment. We're available on Apple Podcast, and for Android users, check out Google Podcast. Also, we're on Stitcher, Spotify, TuneIn Radio, and on your favorite podcast app. Until next time, remember, sound is half the picture.